The war had ended 3 hours ago, but Admiral Grace Holloway could still smell the burning metal in the recycled air of her ship. She stood alone on the observation deck of the carrier Relentless Dawn and watched the broken enemy vessels drift past her viewport like dead fish floating in a dark ocean. The Vethrani warships had been beautiful once with their curved hulls and silver plating, but now they were just twisted wreckage spinning slowly. Through the void behind her, the bridge crew worked in exhausted silence. Some were treating wounds. Others were running damage reports. A few were simply staring at nothing because they had seen too much death today to process anything else. Commander Lucas Perry walked up beside her. He had a deep cut on his forehead that had been hastily bandaged, and dried blood still caked one side of his face. He looked like he had aged 10 years in the past 12 hours. Casualty. Report, Admiral, he said in a voice that carried no emotion because emotion was a luxury. Neither of them could afford right now. How bad? 2,412 dead. Another 800 in critical condition. We lost the destroyers Gallant and Morning Star with all hands. Grace closed her eyes. Behind her eyelids she saw faces. Young men and women from Earth and Mars and the outer colonies who had signed up to serve, because they believed in something bigger than themselves. They had families waiting for them. Parents who would never see their children again. Spouses who would sleep alone for the rest of their lives. Children who would grow up with only photographs and memories. And the Salvari delegation we were protecting? She asked. All safe. Every single one of them. Their ambassador wants to express his gratitude personally. Tell him I am busy. She did not want gratitude. She wanted answers. She wanted to know why human soldiers kept dying for people who never seemed to fight for themselves. This was the 17th time in 6 years that human forces had been sent to rescue Concord member species from threats they could not handle alone. The Vethrani Dominion had been attacking Concord borders for decades, and every time the Council voted to respond, it was human ships that led the charge. Human Marines who boarded enemy vessels. Human engineers who kept damaged ships flying when any sane assessment said they should be scrap metal. The other species called it human stubbornness. Grace called it being taken for granted. She returned to her quarters later that night and found a communication waiting from Concord High Command. The holographic image of High Arbiter Velmorith materialized in the center of her room. He was tall and insectoid with compound eyes that reflected the light in strange patterns and mandibles that clicked together when he spoke. Admiral Holloway, he said in a tone that was meant to sound warm but came across as rehearsed. The Concord congratulates you on another magnificent victory. The Salvari people are deeply grateful for your service. With respect, High Arbiter, we need to discuss fleet disposition for the northern sectors. My ships are exhausted. My crews are undermanned. We have been requesting reinforcements from the Caliph and Morvani fleets for 3 months now. Velmorith's compound eyes shifted in a way that Grace had learned to recognize as discomfort. Yes, well, the Caliph are currently undergoing their seasonal meditation cycle. It is a sacred tradition that cannot be interrupted. And the Morvani have raised concerns about radiation levels in the combat zones, affecting their crystalline biological matrices. Perhaps the human fleets could extend their patrol routes temporarily until these issues are resolved. Temporarily, Grace repeated. The word tasted bitter in her mouth. The Concord recognizes the sacrifice of human personnel and will address this matter formally in the next council session, which is scheduled for 14 standard months from now. The transmission ended, and Grace sat alone in the darkness of her quarters for a long time. Somewhere on this ship, families were receiving notifications that their loved ones would not be coming home. Tomorrow she would write letters to each of them as she always did. And in those letters she would struggle to explain why their sons and daughters had died protecting people who could not be bothered to attend a council meeting about the problem. On Earth, the same frustrations. We're building in different rooms. President Daniel Reeves sat at the head of a long table in the Federation capital, surrounded by his most trusted advisors. He was 63 years old, with gray hair and tired eyes that had seen too many casualty reports cross his desk. His grandfather had served on the first human delegation to make contact with alien civilizations, and the stories of that historic meeting had shaped his entire worldview. He had grown up believing in the promise of galactic cooperation, but promises meant nothing when measured against body counts. "The numbers do not lie, sir," Chief of Staff Maria Santos said as she spread holographic data across the table. Charts and graphs floated in the air, showing statistics that told a story of profound imbalance. In the last 50 years, human casualties in Concord military operations exceed 4 million. Combined casualties from all other member species total approximately 12,000. "Because they send observers," Defense Secretary Nathan Cole added. His voice carried the bitterness of a man who had lost friends to wars that should not have been theirs to fight. "Ships that hang back during battles. Advisors who advise us to die for them. Medical vessels that somehow always arrive after the fighting is over." Treasury Secretary Helen Park pulled up additional data. "We have also been subsidizing their economies for generations. The Concord Free Trade Agreements have benefited every member world except ours. We provide advanced agricultural techniques to species that mastered space travel when humans were still living in caves. We share medical research freely. We build infrastructure on their worlds at our own expense. And what do we receive in return? The privilege of bleeding for them." President Reeves rubbed his temples. A headache was building behind his eyes. "What about the Korathi?" "They have always been our strongest allies in the Concord." Maria shook her head. "Ambassador Dorth expressed sympathy when I met with him yesterday, but he said his government cannot go against the Concord majority. He personally apologized and suggested that perhaps humanity should consider adjusting our expectations. His exact words were that humans must learn the galaxy does not revolve around our concerns." The room fell silent. Through the windows of the Capitol building, cherry blossoms drifted on a spring breeze. Children played in the parks below. Families walked together, enjoying the sunshine, completely unaware of the conversations happening in this room that would shape the future of their species. "So what are you suggesting?" Reeves asked quietly. Nathan leaned forward. "We stop. We honor our existing treaty obligations. We complete our current deployments. And then we stop volunteering for every crisis that comes along. Let the Concord handle its own problems for once. Let them learn what it means to fight their own battles. They will say we are abandoning them." Helen met his eyes without flinching. "With respect, sir, they abandoned us a long time ago. They just expected us to be too noble to notice." President Reeves looked around the table at the faces of people he trusted. They were not warmongers or isolationists. They were simply tired. Tired of sacrifice without recognition. Tired of partnership without reciprocity. Tired of watching human families grieve while alien species offered nothing but empty words of gratitude. He thought about his grandfather and the idealism of that first contact. He thought about the dream of a united galaxy working together toward common goals. And then he thought about the 4 million names on the memorial walls. 4 million humans who had given everything for a dream that had never truly existed. "Draft a proposal," he said finally. "I want options on my desk by the end of the week." The decision had not been made yet. But in that moment, everyone in the room knew that something fundamental had changed. Humanity had carried the weight of the galaxy on its shoulders for 300 years. And now, for the first time, they were beginning to wonder what would happen if they simply set that burden down and walked away. The announcement came 6 months later, on a day that would be remembered across the galaxy for centuries. President Daniel Reeves stood at the central podium of the Galactic Concord Assembly Hall on Theranos. Prime, the vast amphitheater stretched out before him, filled with representatives from 47 different species. Some had traveled for weeks to attend this emergency session. Others had sent holographic projections from distant worlds. All of them had come because rumors had been spreading through diplomatic channels for months, and everyone wanted to hear the truth directly from human leadership. The hall was magnificent, in a way that had always made Reeves uncomfortable. Crystal spires rose toward a ceiling that displayed real-time images of distant galaxies. Floating platforms carried delegates from species that could not survive in standard gravity. Translation devices hummed softly, converting his words into hundreds of languages simultaneously. He looked out at the assembled faces. Some watched with curiosity. Others barely paid attention, checking their personal devices or whispering to their aides. A few seemed almost bored, as if this was just another routine diplomatic function that would end with empty promises and ceremonial handshakes.
They had no idea what was coming. For 3 centuries, Reeves began, the human species has proudly served as a member of this august body. We have shared our innovations with you freely. We have given our resources without asking for fair compensation. And most painfully, we have given our children. Generation after generation of young, humans who believed in the ideals of this concord and gave their lives defending them. Pause, letting the words settle over the crowd like falling snow. We have answered every call for help. We have met every obligation placed upon us. We have exceeded every expectation. When the Vethrani threatened your borders, it was human fleets that pushed them back. When plagues swept through your worlds, it was human doctors who developed cures. When your economies faltered, it was human resources that kept them afloat. Some delegates were beginning to shift in their seats now, sensing that this speech was not heading toward the usual expressions of continued cooperation. Effective immediately, the United Human Federation is withdrawing from all non-essential concord operations. The hall went silent. Completely silent. Even the constant hum of translation devices seemed to pause, as if the machines themselves could not believe what they had just processed. We'll maintain our embassy presence on Theranos Prime. We will honor existing trade agreements until their scheduled expiration. We will continue basic diplomatic relations with all member species. However, we will no longer be deploying military forces to protect Concord interests. We will no longer be providing emergency humanitarian aid to Concord worlds. We will no longer be subsidizing Concord development projects. Now the silence shattered into chaos. Delegates leaped from their seats, shouting in a dozen different languages. High Arbiter Velmorth pounded his ceremonial staff against the podium, trying desperately to restore order. The translation devices created a cacophony of overlapping protests that made individual words impossible to distinguish. Ambassador Dorth of the Karathi rose from his seat, his golden fur bristling with agitation. This is unprecedented. He shouted loud enough to cut through the noise. You cannot simply abandon your responsibilities to this body. Reeves smiled, but there was no warmth in it. Responsibilities, Ambassador? Let me tell you about responsibilities. When the Vethrani threatened your homeworld last decade, who sent 3 entire fleets to defend it? Humanity. When the Selvari faced famine, who shipped emergency food supplies at our own expense? Humanity. When the Morvani crystalline plague threatened to become a galactic pandemic, who developed the cure and distributed it freely to every affected world? Humanity. Those were partnership efforts undertaken by the entire Concord, Dorth protested. Partnership? Reeves let out a short, bitter laugh. Your species contributed a single medical frigate to the crystalline plague response. 1 ship. It arrived 2 weeks after we had already contained the outbreak and treated 90% of the infected population. That is not partnership, Ambassador. That is showing up after the work is done and expecting credit for participation. He gathered his notes from the podium. The Federation has been a good partner to this Concord. Perhaps too good. We enabled your dependence on us because we believed in the ideals of galactic cooperation. But ideals do not bring back the dead. Principles do not comfort families who lost everything protecting. People who could not be bothered to attend memorial services for fallen soldiers. Reeves walked out of the chamber without looking back. The reaction across Concord space was immediate and divided. Some species expressed shock and urged immediate reconciliation efforts. Diplomatic missions were dispatched to Earth carrying offers of negotiation and promises of reform. Others dismissed the withdrawal as a temporary tantrum, convinced that humanity would return once they understood how much they needed the Concord, the Vethrani Dominion. Monitoring events from their border territories, began quietly mobilizing their forces. 17 light-years from Theranos Prime on the frontier world of New Providence, the news arrived like a punch to the stomach. Colonel Benjamin Drake stood on the landing platform of the human military base watching Salvari trainees run combat drills in the valley below. He had spent 4 years on this world training local defense forces and maintaining peace in a region plagued by pirate activity. 4 years of building something that mattered. "They are not ready," his executive officer, Major Patricia Shaw, said quietly. "Give me another year, maybe 2, and they would have a solid defensive capability. But right now, they cannot protect themselves." "Not our problem anymore," Drake replied, though his voice carried no satisfaction. "Orders are orders. The governor is requesting another meeting. This is his 5th request today," Drake sighed. Governor Tarvel had been sending increasingly desperate messages since the withdrawal announcement. The Selvari were a peaceful species whose entire civilization was built on consensus and cooperation. The concept of self-defense through violence was philosophically offensive to them. They had joined the Concord specifically so they would never need to develop military capabilities of their own. "Tell him I will see him in an hour. But Patricia, start the evacuation protocols. We are leaving by the end of the month, whether they are ready or not." The meeting was one of the hardest conversations Drake had ever endured. Governor Tarvel sat across from him in the base conference room. He was typical of his species, with 4 arms and large dark eyes that conveyed emotion more clearly than any human face. Right now, those eyes were filled with something between desperation and disbelief. "You protected us," Tarvel said through his translator. "You taught us. You became part of our community. Does none of that mean anything to you?" "It means everything to me," Drake answered honestly. "I have friends here. Good people I respect and admire. Leaving them is one of the hardest things I've ever had to do. Then why? Why abandon us now when we need you most?" Drake leaned forward, trying to find words that would not sound cruel. "Governor, my people have been protecting yours for almost a century. In all that time, your government has never once invested in serious defensive capabilities. You had human soldiers to do the dying for you, so why bother? Violence is against our nature. Our philosophy teaches that all conflict can be resolved through understanding and dialogue. That is a beautiful philosophy. I respect it genuinely. But the Vethrani do not share it. The pirates who raid your shipping lanes do not share it. The galaxy is full of predators who see your peaceful nature as weakness and your undefended borders as opportunity." Tarvel's 4 hands clasped together in the Selvari gesture of deep distress. "The Concord will send others to replace you. Will they?" Drake met the governor's eyes directly. "In 300 years, how many non-human Concord forces have ever been deployed to actual combat? How many have taken enemy fire? How many have held defensive lines while civilians evacuated? How many have bled for strangers?" He shook his head slowly. "You know the answer as well as I do, Governor. The number is essentially 0. The governor had no response. "I am truly sorry," Drake said as he rose to leave. "You might want to start hoping the Vethrani do not notice when we are gone." Across human space, similar scenes played out on hundreds of worlds. Scientists concluded research partnerships and packed their equipment. Engineers finished ongoing projects and trained local personnel in maintenance procedures. Medical staff transferred patients and closed clinics that had served millions for generations. It was not done in anger. It was done with professionalism and even sadness. But it was done completely and thoroughly. When humanity walked away, they did not leave anything behind that could be used to pretend things had not fundamentally changed. Admiral Grace Holloway oversaw the military withdrawal, personally ensuring every unit departed in good order. In some cases, this meant destroying facilities rather than leaving them for species who had never earned the right to use them. "It feels like defeat," Commander Lucas Perry admitted as they watched the last human vessels leave the Theranos system. "Like we are running away from everything we built." Running away would have been leaving without warning, Grace replied. This is walking away with dignity. There is a difference, is there? She watched the stars for a long moment before answering. Ask me again in a few years. We will find out together whether this was wisdom or the biggest mistake humanity ever made. It started small, as most disasters do. A mining outpost in the Dravari system stopped responding to communication signals. The Selvari government waited 3 days, hoping it was simply a technical malfunction, before sending an investigation team to check on the facility. That team also went silent. By the time anyone mustered enough courage to send a proper military force, the Vithrani raiders had already stripped the outpost bare and disappeared, back across the border with 47 prisoners. The Concord High Council held an emergency session to discuss the attack. Representatives argued for hours about proper responses and diplomatic channels and measured reactions. By the time they finished arguing, 2 more outposts had been hit. They are testing us, Governor Tarvel reported in a desperate transmission to the council. His voice trembled with fear that he could not hide. Small raids on isolated targets? They want to see if anyone will respond. They want to know if we can defend ourselves without the humans. No one responded. The Karathi claimed their remaining fleet was needed to protect their own borders. The Morvani stated that their crystalline ships were too valuable to risk in combat operations. The Kelith announced they were entering an emergency meditation cycle to seek guidance from their ancestors. 6 months after humanity walked away, the Vithrani stopped testing and started conquering. The first major offensive came without warning. 3 Concord systems fell in the opening week. Vithrani warships poured through border defenses that had been designed to support human vessels that were no longer there. Defensive stations built to human specifications sat empty, because no other species had crews trained to operate them. 2 more systems fell in the second week, then 3 more. By the end of the first month, the Vithrani had pushed deeper into Concord territory than any previous invasion in recorded history. Refugee ships fled in every direction, carrying survivors who had lost everything. Distress signals flooded communication channels, but there was no one left to answer them. On Earth, the news arrived with strange. Detachment government analysts provided daily briefings on the developing situation. Politicians issued carefully worded statements expressing concern and sympathy. Veterans watched the reports with grim recognition, seeing exactly what they had predicted unfolding in real time. Admiral Grace Holloway had retired to a small coastal town in Maine. She spent her days reading books and walking on the beach and trying not to think about the decisions that had led to this moment. She had served the Concord faithfully for 40 years and watched too many good people die for ungrateful allies. Walking away had felt like the right choice. Now, she was not so sure. One morning in late autumn, a shuttle landed on the beach near her cottage. She watched from her window as a familiar figure emerged and walked slowly toward her door. Ambassador Dorith looked nothing like the proud diplomat she remembered. His golden fur was matted and dirty. His fine robes were torn and stained. He moved like someone carrying a weight too heavy for his body. She opened the door before he could knock. "May I come in?" he asked. His voice was barely a whisper. "Coffee, please." They sat in her study, surrounded by books and memorabilia from decades of service. Rain streaked down the windows. The ambassador held his cup with shaking hands and stared at nothing for a long time before speaking. "The Korathi defense fleet was destroyed 2 days ago," he said finally. 400 ships. 90,000 of my people. The Vithrani caught them in the Meridian Corridor and did not even slow down. Grace said nothing. There was nothing to say. "I watched my homeworld burn from orbit," Dorith continued. His voice cracked, but he forced himself to keep speaking. "The cities where I grew up, the schools where my children learned, the temples where my ancestors are buried, all of it gone in a matter of hours. I am sorry, are you?" He looked up and met her eyes. "You warned us this would happen. You told us we were not prepared. We did not listen. We thought you were exaggerating. We thought you were trying to manipulate us into giving you more resources, more recognition, more respect. He let out a sound that might have been a laugh if it had contained any humor. We were fools. Yes, you were. The Concord is formally requesting that humanity return to active participation in galactic defense. Requesting. Dorth set down his cup and lowered himself to his knees on her floor. Among the Karathi, this was the deepest form of submission, a gesture reserved only for moments of absolute desperation. I'm begging you, Admiral. Not as a diplomat representing my government because my government no longer exists. I am begging you, as someone who watched everything he loved turn to ash, as someone who has nowhere else to turn and no other hope remaining. Grace looked at the proud ambassador kneeling before her and felt something shift inside her chest. Anger and satisfaction and pity and sorrow all mixed together into an emotion she could not name. My government made its position clear, she said carefully. We will not go back to the way things were. Positions can change. Circumstances have changed, have they? She leaned forward. What exactly has changed, Ambassador? Are the Kelith finally going to wake up from their meditation and actually fight? Are the Morvani going to risk their precious crystalline ships? Are the Selvar going to develop the weapons they find philosophically distasteful? Dorth had no answer. You are not asking us to help you. You are asking us to save you again. And if we do, what happens after? Do we go back to being your expendable shield? Do our children go back to dying for people who never learned to protect themselves? What would you have us do? Fight. The word came out harder than she intended. Your people, the Selvar, the Morvani, everyone. Stop waiting for someone else to solve your problems. Stop treating military service as something beneath your dignity. Stop expecting us to bleed so you can keep your hands clean. Dorth was quiet for a long time. Finally he rose and moved to the window, watching the rain fall on the gray ocean beyond. We were ancient when your species was young, he said softly. We had already seen so much war, so much death, so much destruction. When we formed the Concord, we believed we could build something better. A civilization where conflict was managed through diplomacy, where violence was unnecessary, where enlightened species could rise above primitive impulses. He turned back to face her. We were not wrong about the ideal. We were wrong about the method. We outsourced our violence to you because you were willing to do it. We told ourselves it was because humans were naturally suited for combat. But the truth is, we were afraid. Afraid to fight. Afraid to die. Afraid that violence would make us into something we did not want to be. That fear is killing your people right now. Yes, it is. He nodded slowly, and she saw tears forming in his large golden eyes. And I do not know if we can overcome it in time to save what remains. After he left, Grace sat alone for hours as the storm grew stronger outside. Memories flooded through her mind. Battles won and battles lost. Friends who never came home. The idealism of her youth slowly ground down by decades of thankless service. She had believed in the Concord once. She had believed that different species could work together toward common goals. That cooperation could triumph over conflict. That sacrifice would be recognized and honored. Maybe that was still possible, but not the old way. Not with humanity carrying the burden. Alone, she picked up her communicator and placed a call to an old friend at Federation Command. I need to know the current readiness status of the reserve fleets. Admiral Holloway. I thought you retired. Just answer the question, Captain. Pause on the other end. Full combat readiness. We have been expecting this call for months. Of course you have. She ended the transmission and stared at the communicator in her hand. The choice before her was not simple. Nothing worth doing ever was. But somewhere out there, people were dying. Innocent people who had never voted for the policies that failed them. Children who would never grow up because no one was there to protect them. Humanity had walked away to teach the galaxy a lesson. The lesson had been learned in blood and fire and the ashes of burning worlds. Now the question was whether anyone would survive long, enough to build something better from the ruins. Human fleet that arrived at the Battle of Karavath was unlike anything the galaxy had seen before. These were not the same ships that had served the Concorde for 3 centuries. These vessels carried volunteers who had chosen to be here. Men and women who understood exactly what they were fighting for and what they were not fighting for. They had come not because the Concorde demanded it, but because they could not stand by. While innocent people died, Admiral Grace Holloway stood on the bridge of the carrier, unyielding spirit, watching the Vethrani Armada arrange itself across the darkness of space. Hundreds of crescent-shaped warships filled the viewport, their silver hulls gleaming with weapons that had torn through every defense the Concorde could offer. They moved with the confidence of predators who had never known defeat. "They outnumber us 3-1, Commander Lucas Perry observed. He had come out of retirement the same day Grace had, unable to stay home while history unfolded without him. "Would not be the first time we faced bad odds," Grace replied, but she was not looking at the enemy fleet. She was looking at the ships flying beside her own. The ragged remnants of the Korthi fleet held position on her left flank. These were survivors who had watched their homeworld burn and refused to stop fighting. Their golden hulls were scarred and patched with whatever materials they could find. Some ships were held together with little more than emergency welds and desperate hope. But they were here. Behind them came a small formation of Selvari vessels. Their crews had never fired a weapon in anger before this war. Violence went against everything their culture believed. But they had watched their colonies fall one by one and finally decided that some principles were worth less than survival. Even a handful of Morvani ships had joined the fleet. Their crystalline hulls hummed with frequencies that disrupted enemy targeting systems. For generations, the Morvani had claimed their ships were too valuable to risk in combat. Now they had learned that ships meant nothing if there was no civilization left to fly them. It was not much. But it was more than humanity had ever fought beside before. The communication screen flickered and the image of Supreme Commander Kurteth appeared. He was massive even by Vethrani standards, with scaled hide covered in ceremonial scars that marked his victories. His yellow eyes studied Grace with predatory interest. "Humans," he growled through the translator. "You returned to die alongside your weakling allies. This is unexpected. I thought you had finally developed wisdom, Supreme Commander. I am Admiral Holloway. I assume you know my record." "I do. You are the one my people call the Iron Grandmother. You have killed many Vethrani warriors over the years. Some of them were friends of mine. I have. And I would rather not kill any more. Your war is with the Concorde government, not with the civilians your forces have been slaughtering. Withdraw now, and we can discuss terms for peace." Atreth laughed. The sound was like stones grinding together. "Discuss. You abandoned these weaklings, Admiral. You've proved what we always suspected. The Concorde was never strong. It was only held together by human foolishness and human blood. Now you return with a pitiful fleet of damaged ships and frightened aliens, and you want to discuss peace?" He leaned toward the screen, and his yellow eyes burned with contempt. "We will destroy you here today. Then we will take whatever we want from whatever remains of your precious Concorde. The age of weakness is over, Admiral. The age of the Vethrani has begun." "Maybe you were right," Grace said calmly. "But what happens next might surprise you." The transmission ended, and the battle began. The first hour went badly. The Vethrani pressed their numerical advantage, hard attacking from multiple directions at once. Human ships took heavy damage. Some were destroyed outright, their crews dying in explosions that lit up the darkness like brief, angry stars. The Allied forces struggled to work together their different technologies and combat styles. Clashing, instead of complementing each other, Grace watched the tactical display and felt doubt creeping into her heart. Maybe this had been a mistake. Maybe she had led all these people to their deaths for nothing. Then something unexpected happened. The Selvari ships, which had hung back during the initial engagement, suddenly surged forward. Their captains had been observing the Vethrani attack patterns, and their consensus-based decision-making had processed that information faster than any individual mind could. They began calling out enemy movements before they happened, predicting strikes with uncanny accuracy. "Vethrani destroyer group turning to flank our left side." a Selvari captain announced over the fleet channel. They will arrive in 47 seconds. Grace redirected forces to meet the threat and found the Selvari prediction was exactly correct. The flanking attack was crushed before it could develop. Ow. Did you know that? She demanded. We watched. We analyzed. We understood. Selvari captain paused. This is what we do, Admiral. We have always been good at understanding patterns. We simply never applied it to violence before. On the right flank, the Morvani ships discovered something remarkable about their crystalline hulls. When Vethrani energy weapons struck them, the crystal did not just absorb the energy. It redirected it in cascading feedback loops that overloaded enemy targeting computers. Vethrani gunners found their own. Weapons turning against them as the Morvani learned to angle there. Ships like mirrors reflecting death. Back at its source, and the Korathi fought like nothing Grace had ever witnessed. These were not the cautious diplomatic beings she remembered from council chambers. These were warriors who had lost everything and had nothing left to fear. Their golden fur matted with blood and their elegant ships burning around them, they threw themselves at the enemy with a ferocity that shocked everyone, including themselves. A Korathi battlecruiser rammed directly into a Vethrani command ship. Both vessels exploded together, but the Korathi captain transmitted one final message before the end. For our homeworld, for our children, for everything they took from us. Grace felt tears forming in her eyes, but she did not have time for grief. She had a battle to win. Commander Perry, redirect our third attack wing to support the Korathi assault. Tell the Selvari to extend their prediction network to cover our flanks. And get me a channel to the Morvani flagship. I have an idea. The battle raged for 9 hours. Ships died on both sides. Crews fought until their vessels fell apart around them. The void filled with wreckage and bodies, and the silent screams of the dying, but slowly and possibly the tide began to turn. The Allied fleet learned to work together in ways they never had before. Selvari predictions guided human strikes. Morvani defenses protected Korathi assault ships. Human carriers provided cover for damaged Allied vessels. Each species contributed what they did best. And together, they became something greater than the sum of their parts. Supreme. Commander Kurteth died in the 8th hour of battle. His flagship was torn apart by a coordinated assault from all 4 species, striking simultaneously from different angles. His final transmission was a single word in his native language that the translators rendered as impossible. When the battle ended, the Vethrani armada had been shattered. Burning wreckage spread across thousands of kilometers of space. The survivors fled back toward their own territory, carrying news of a defeat that should not have happened. The Allied fleet had paid a terrible price. Nearly half their ships were gone. Thousands had died. But they had won, together. In the aftermath, as rescue operations began and survivors were pulled from drifting wreckage, Grace received a message from the Korathi commander. Her name was Lazara, and she had taken command after her captain died in the ramming attack. Admiral Holloway, my people wish to thank you for returning to fight beside us. Thank your own people, Commander. They fought magnificently today. We fought as you taught us. But we also fought as ourselves. Perhaps for the first time in our history, Lazara paused, and Grace could hear exhaustion and wonder mixed in her voice. We were so afraid before. Afraid that violence would make us less than we wanted to be. But today, I learned something important. Violence can diminish us, yes. But so can cowardice. So can watching others suffer while we hide behind our principles and do nothing. That is a hard lesson to learn. The best lessons usually are, Admiral. The best lessons usually are... Grace ended the transmission and looked out at the stars. Somewhere beyond this battlefield, the galaxy was waiting to see what would happen next. The old Concord was dead. Whatever rose from its ashes would be something new, she found herself, hoping it would be something better. 5 years had passed since the Battle of Karavath, and the galaxy had become unrecognizable. The Vethrani Dominion was broken. Their military had shattered against the combined strength of species they had dismissed as weak, and their empire had fragmented into competing factions. Some sought peace, exhausted by decades of war and hungry for stability. Others continued raiding isolated targets, but without unified command, they were nuisances rather than existential threats. The Galactic Concord still existed, but it had transformed into something entirely new. The old council chambers, designed for endless debate and careful diplomacy, had been redesigned into a joint military command center. Holographic displays showed fleet positions across dozens of sectors. Officers from multiple species worked side by side, coordinating patrols and responding to threats. Military service was no longer outsourced to a single species. Every member world contributed forces according to their capabilities. Every species trained together and fought together and bled together. The days of hiding behind human sacrifice were over forever. Admiral Grace Holloway stood before the new Concord Assembly to receive an honor she had never expected and never wanted. She was 78 years old now, and her hair had gone completely white. Her body ached from decades of service, and her mind carried memories that would never fade. But her eyes were still sharp, and her voice still carried the authority of someone who had seen the worst the galaxy could offer and refused to look away.
High Arbiter Velmorith approached her with a medal resting on a velvet cushion. His compound eyes held none of the dismissive condescension she remembered from their conversations years ago. Time and tragedy had changed him as it had changed everyone. For exceptional service to the Concord and to all the species of this galaxy, he announced, we bestow upon Admiral Grace Holloway the Star of Unity. This is the highest recognition our civilization can offer, and no one has ever deserved it more. The assembled representatives rose in applause. Humans and Korathi and Salvari and Morvani and dozens of other species stood together honoring a woman who had helped save them all. Grace looked out at their faces and felt something she had not felt in a very long time. Hope. I accept this honor, she said when the applause faded, but not for myself. I accept it for everyone who served before we finally got things right. For the humans who died protecting people who did not appreciate their sacrifice. For the Korathi who lost their homeworld and kept fighting anyway. For the Salvari who learned to overcome their deepest beliefs because survival demanded it. For everyone who paid the price of the old way of doing things. She paused and looked around the chamber at beings who had once been strangers and were now something closer to family. When humanity walked away 5 years ago, we did it in anger and frustration. We felt used and unappreciated, and we were right to feel that way. But walking away was never the answer. It was only the beginning of finding the real answer. This truth is, we never wanted to be alone. We never wanted to watch from the sidelines while others suffered. That is not who humans are. But we also could not keep being the only ones willing to sacrifice. That was not sustainable, and it was not fair to anyone. What we have now is not perfect. We still argue. We still disagree. Species that were afraid to fight are still learning how to be brave. But we are learning together. We are carrying the burden together. And that makes all the difference in the universe. After the ceremony, she walked through the gardens of Theranos. Prime with Lucas Perry, he was an admiral himself, now commanding one of the largest combined fleets in Concord history. The twin suns were setting, and long shadows stretched across alien flowers that bloomed in colors humans had no names for. Do you think it will last? He asked. Nothing lasts forever. But this is better than what we had. Better than what we were heading toward. She watched a group of young officers walking past. They were laughing together, and she could see human faces mixed with Korathi fur and Salvari limbs and Morvani crystal. Look at them, Lucas. They do not remember the old days. For them, this is simply how things are. Every species contributing. Every species valued. Every species willing to fight and die for each other. Is that enough? Grace smiled. Ask me again in another 50 years. On Earth, the changes had been equally profound. The Federation had emerged from its period of isolation stronger and more confident than ever before. Human colonies were expanding again, but this time as part of genuine partnerships. Human scientists worked alongside alien colleagues on projects that benefited everyone. Human soldiers trained with beings they had once protected and now considered equals. President Daniel Reeves had retired long ago, but he still received regular updates from the government he had once led. He lived quietly in Virginia, now spending his days reading and gardening and watching his grandchildren grow up in a galaxy that was safer than the one he had inherited. His granddaughter Emma visited him one evening as autumn leaves fell in the garden outside his window. She was 22 years old and had just been accepted into the Concord Joint Academy, where humans and aliens trained together for combined service. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked, pulling out of the Concord back then. He considered the question carefully. It was one he had asked himself many times over the years. "I regret that it was necessary. I regret that so many people had to die before anyone would listen to what we were saying. I regret that we could not find a better way to make them understand." He paused and watched the leaves drift down. "But the decision itself? No, I do not regret that. Sometimes you have to walk away to make people understand what they are losing. Sometimes the only way to build something better is to let the old thing fall apart first." That sounds harsh. It was harsh. It was one of the hardest decisions I ever made, but it was also necessary. The galaxy needed to learn that humanity is not inexhaustible, that our kindness is not weakness, that our patience has limits. They needed to understand that real partnership means everyone gives, not just us. And they learned? They are still learning. That is the best any of us can hope for. That we keep learning and keep growing and keep becoming something better than we were before. In the depths of space aboard a patrol cruiser called Distant Horizon, a young ensign named Kyle Morrison stood his first watch as officer of the deck. His crew was mixed in a way that would have been impossible a generation ago. 2 humans worked alongside a Korathi navigator and a Selvari sensor operator and a Morvani engineer, whose crystalline body hummed softly in the recycled air. They had trained together at the academy. They had eaten together and studied together and become friends in the way that only people who share hardship can become friends. Now they served together protecting a shipping lane that connected a dozen worlds from a dozen different species. "Contact," the Korathi navigator announced. Her name was Tara, and her golden fur rippled as her ears swiveled toward her display. "Single vessel. Configuration suggests Vethrani Raider. Just one ship?" Kyle asked. "Just one. Probably a scout testing our response time." Kyle looked around at his crew. These were beings whose grandparents had been enemies or strangers or helpless victims, depending on which generation you asked. Now they looked back at him, waiting for orders with complete trust in their eyes. "Battle stations," he said calmly. "Let us show them what happens when they test us." The ship jumped to action. Every station was crewed by someone who had chosen to be there, someone who had earned their place through training and sacrifice and mutual respect. As they moved to intercept, Kyle felt something his predecessors had rarely experienced during their long years of thankless service. He felt like he belonged to something real, something worth fighting for, something that would last. The galaxy had nearly destroyed itself by taking humanity for granted. Millions had died and worlds had burned and ancient civilizations had crumbled to dust. But from those ashes something new had risen, something built on genuine partnership and shared sacrifice and the hard-won understanding that no species could stand alone. It was not a perfect galaxy. It never would be. There would always be threats and conflicts and difficult choices. But there would also be friendship across the stars, trust between species that had once been strangers, hope for a future that belonged to everyone. And in the end, that was all anyone could ever ask for.